Namaste and good evening, everyone. I'm greeting Narad. Namaste. And
Namaste to both
Sraddhalu.
and to all present.
We are happy to continue our series, Evenings with Sraddhalu, today part 184. And we are on the same current affairs with part 13. And today we will take a theme on exploring the regime change and the colonizing minds. But first, we will be answering to one of Kurt's question. Unless Narad wants to say something to us, we are happy to have you here.
Thank you, Ami.
Kurt, he writes, first, to use the right terms is very important in order to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. You say often soul instead of soul being / psychic being, but there is a difference between both. The soul comes from the Jivatman and develops in the evolution from life to life as a psychic being. Second, there can never be a trauma in the soul or psychic being, but only in the instrumental being of mind, life, and body.
Yes, it's an important clarification, and I was assuming one didn't need to go into detail generally, but I think it's a good occasion to go somewhat into detail on this, because the last time I made mention of how there can be a trauma which can be carried by the soul and even into the next life. And so the soul word becomes problematic. So just to put the word itself in context, we have to understand that in the English language, the word is very loosely used. Soul represents any kind of individuality. So you can say a good person is often referred to as a good soul. Or soul is used to describe a kind of deep sentimental state. So they will say soulful music, that is music which evokes nostalgia or sentimentality of a certain kind. But in the specific use of the word by Sri Aurobindo, we have to distinguish between what comes also from various religious traditions, when each has its own particular usage of the term. Sometimes it's a translation from another language, which adds another dimension of complication. Sri Aurobindo explains the word by distinguishing between three souls. So we have what may be described, what he calls the desire soul, which is the sense of the surface individuality. When you say I, who is the person you are referring to? And if you try to define yourself or introduce somebody else, let's say a good friend, you say, so such and such a person, tell me more about him, and well, you give a list of likes, dislikes. So he likes this, he doesn't like that, he does this, he doesn't do that. Sometimes work related, but still, the way in which you know me is in terms of likes and dislikes, or my behavior patterns, which are not yet me, but just patterns of personality, you might say. But when you speak of soul, what do I like, what I don't like, is generally what it reduces to. And so Sri Aurobindo describes this as desire soul. It's defined as a bundle of desires. But that's not truly me. Even subjectively, I can say, deep inside me, the way I feel myself, the way I actually am, is so different, and people don't know me. If only they knew me. That's the kind of statements you will hear from people. But what is it that you are when you are in that center, from which you don't always live? You live mostly on this surface reactionary personality, but still in that center. And if you had to describe that, you would come out with a list of positive descriptions. I'm a creative person, I'm a loving person, I appreciate beauty and art, I want people to be happy, I try to be of service to people, etc. All are positive descriptions. But then we find this contradiction between the surface personality and this inner soul. This is the vocabulary Sri Aurobindo uses. The inner soul, because I am sensitive, because I am loving and caring, I get upset when things don't go the way I want it to. Because I like things to be beautiful and ordered, I get angry when somebody makes it disorderly. So you notice this inner soul and the reactive surface nature often are in contradiction. And yet the bulk of your interface with the world is of the surface reactive nature. And if you were asked, why don't you live from here? It's a difficult point. Subjectively we feel, although we are this, we don't live there, we live somewhere in between. And more often than not on the surface layers. But even this inner soul is not the true soul. It is a reflection of something still deeper. And when you go deep, all the way to the deepest that one can, then we discover the true soul or the psychic being. These are the two phrases Sri Aurobindo uses to describe that. The psychic being is the immortal person that actually chose to take birth, that carries the content of this life into the next and grows across lives, which takes on all these layers for the incarnation, discards the layers when they are utilized and no more of use or cannot be carried on, and so on. But this being the case, yes, we distinguish psychic being from the common and mixed usage of the word soul. Generally, when I speak of soul, I mean the psychic being in the context of the yoga. I don't use it in the other ways. There I would say person, etc. But still, Kurt's observation that there can be no trauma in the psychic being, but only in the instrumental being, yes, technically true, but it's half the truth. There is also such something which Sri Aurobindo describes as the psychic personality. What the psychic being forms as the content of what it has built up across lives, in terms of maturity, in terms of capacity, and all of that accumulated actually builds a personality. You can say the psychic being itself grows, but in its growth, it takes on these very specific forms, aspects, capacities, specific kinds of knowledge, skills. All of these are as if absorbed from the mental, vital and physical bodies to the extent that those things have been integrated with the soul consciousness. The result is the maturing of the psychic being and the psychic personality, and the psychic personality is not so distantly deep within. As the soul infuses itself into the body and as the personality grows in childhood, the content of the soul's personality is gradually infused into the layers of our instrumental being, in the mind, in the life, in the body. To the extent these have been evolved, developed and stabilized in the soul's consciousness, they can be infused, and often these become the first point of contact of the influence of the psychic being in the personality. Now it is in this part, what we may call the psychic personality, in the part of the soul's growth content, let's say, that there can be trauma, and there can also be trauma in the soul, of the soul, which I'll shortly describe. So yes, although technically one can say that the psychic being essentially of the divine consciousness cannot be in trauma, but there is a vocabulary the mother uses of a psychic sadness, in which the psychic being feels itself blocked by the surface personality, prevented from fulfilling its purpose, or in the surface personality there is a denial or a rejection of the deeper values of the soul or of the divine. There is even a perversion, and the psychic being, insufficiently developed, is unable to exercise its influence on the personality, and as a result it suffers. And Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase specifically in one of the letters. He says, the self, of course, there can be no suffering, but the psychic being a projection in space and time, and there a finite expression of the self or the divine consciousness, and operating within limitations of capacity, can suffer. Now, the nature of that suffering may not correspond to the same thing as the suffering in the mind or emotions or the body. And so one could say, yes, but that's not suffering, and you can play with words. But yes, there is such a thing for which a vocabulary of suffering could be applied at the level of the psychic being. And in the content of its personality as it is developed, and because that part is infused into the surface layers, there can be a damage. Now, this damage can happen from various means. A severe distortion in the personality would imprint in that layer and would be carried over. Cases of possession, cases of damage caused by certain kinds of exposure to drugs. And this is the reason why these drugs can be extremely harmful. And sometimes holes are created in the personality, not only in your subtle body, but in the imprint of it in the psychic personality that is carried over. And I will give a couple of examples here of how even from the physical body elements can be carried over. I think it is in the case of the mother's granddaughter, or is it great granddaughter, that the mother said of her that she was one of the royalty who was guillotined during the French Revolution. And the woman showed some of her friends that on some part of the neck there was still the scar mark. The memory of the guillotine in the physical body, but because it's a trauma for the soul consciousness to be suddenly cut off like this, to be blocked in its evolutionary journey, but also with a severe trauma on a psycho-spiritual level, it retains an imprint of that trauma and can even retain it at a material level. Of course, you will say technically it is carried in the psychic personality, not in the psychic being in its essential content. To me, this is just a play of words. The fact is, the psychic being that is in this incarnation going into the next is carrying this trauma. Where there has been damage through examples of possession and imbalance even of personality as a result of severe trauma, tendencies for that are carried over into the next. So when I use the word soul, using it generally for all that which is carried over into the next, because it includes so many distinctions, layers, but you cannot really say this part is this layer and that part is that layer. In the experience there is a continuum. So you can say psychic personality distinct from psychic being. You're playing with words. It is the being that is evolving in personality, isn't it? So in the experience itself, the two become almost indistinguishable. The only thing you can say is the self behind, of which the psychic being is the projection and representative as the incarnating soul. That self is, of course, immune to all this. And because the psychic being is essentially that consciousness, it carries that immunity in its core, in its essence. So beyond a point, one should not get too technical in the way we cut this up. It is in the experience, it is a continuum. And so I've used this phrase in this sense. And the important thing is not the technicality. The important thing is the idea which I was trying to convey, that something is carried over, a trauma is carried over with the soul consciousness and in the soul consciousness. And the soul can make a choice regarding what it wants to do even about it, and sometimes it can take an incarnation or two to undo certain kinds of damage. Let me give you another example of a soul which has suffered intensely in a certain incarnation, let's say because of circumstances. Well, the psychic being will use it as a means of growth, strengthening, etc. Nevertheless, the imprint of that suffering remains. And a few incarnations down, you will find in the personality a strong reaction towards things associated with that group or that space or that ideology under which it suffered. So what carried it across and held it across multiple lives? So I'm not too interested in the distinctions one could make technically. Rather simply recognize that the journey of the psychic being across lives and in its evolution, although essentially in the core it has a great power and immunity and potential for overcoming anything and everything, in the journey itself it begins from a position of insufficient capacity and can suffer and can carry over certain elements of that suffering in its overall content of what is taken into the next lives. So without getting too technical, I think this would be a clarification on the point. I also wanted to read out one passage which last time I mentioned, and I said I was paraphrasing, but I think it's worth reading because Sri Aurobindo brings a clarity and depth when he comments on things. You remember I had spoken of how in the temperament of the Indian people and the European at the time, let's say, and it's a general statement, one cannot say everybody is like that, but I want to read from this. This is from one of the conversations that Pavitra Philippe Barbier Saint-Hilaire, Frenchman, had with Sri Aurobindo, and he presented to him a certain book which had images of materializations and things like that, and wanted to have Sri Aurobindo's comment after going through the book. Sri Aurobindo's comment, I have no time to read such books. I simply had a glance at the photo, it was quite enough for me. They show that these are manifestations of vital entities of the lowest order, what the church calls devils. One has simply to look at the picture to know what the matter is. The look of the eyes is quite devilish. Nothing good can come of this. Absolutely nothing. It is just the opposite of spiritual science. This phrase is important. Spiritual science. Then he explains, if European scientists enter on this way, that is materializations and mediumistic methods as a way of exploring spiritual science, supposedly, he says, if European scientists enter on this way, the consequences may be disastrous. They are trying to rend the veil put by nature between the physical and the vital. And if this way is widespread, the result will be mass possession and a grip by these beings that will become stronger and stronger upon humanity. I especially wanted to read this because you will link it to what we discussed earlier in the early parts of this particular series on current affairs, where we spoke of the Cabal and the satanic practices and their attempt to infuse the satanic influences and values through their music, through drugs, through certain kinds of orgies, parties, and things like that. And you will understand how this works. I spoke there about how there's these influences which tend to infuse into people at that point. The result will be mass possession and a grip by these beings that will become stronger and stronger upon humanity. Usually these vital beings can act upon man only through his desires and passions. So you have a strong desire, strong passion, something comes and nudges, amplifies, pulls, pushes, that's about all. But if one opens himself to them in this way, as the mediums do, they can directly contact the physical being and their sway can prove to be very harmful. Europe is still protected by the grossness of its mind. This was one of the points I had referred to. After all, I do not think such practices can spread very far. Occult forces would intervene to stop them. Very interesting. So while this was happening, when Sri Aurobindo's conversation takes place, this is 1926, and as I said in the previous century, the first 10 years particularly, there were a lot of these things. They just faded out after a point. And very likely it's these kinds of interventions to stop it. But it is far worse than a purely negative skepticism. Here there is a total perversion and a complete opposition to all that is spiritual, and it would stand in the way of the spiritual evolution of humanity. There is here an atmosphere that kills all that is spiritual. It is a very repulsive atmosphere, and I would not like to have anything to do with all these people. Now you must understand the word spiritual the way Sri Aurobindo is using, and then in the New Age, the same word is mixed with a lot of spiritism and shamanism, which deals with these lower grade vital beings, and that comes in the category of spiritual. So shamanic leader becomes a spiritual leader in the New Age mix, and you have to be very careful. Don't get carried away by these things, by the names used, designations given. Someone does spiritual healing, no, they are doing vital healing. Some of them are doing channelings and they call it spiritual knowledge, spiritual revelation, spiritual teachings. No, they are channeled content from maybe higher vital beings instead of lower vital, but still vital beings, not spiritual. Then the author of the book who's exploring all this, of him Sri Aurobindo says, Dr. Geli may be unaffected, he is there simply as a spectator, but for the medium there is a danger of moral degradation and a loss of all moral control. Even on the spectator there can be an effect. A kind of cloud is spread on the lowest part of the vital, and under its cover anything can break in. So, warning to everybody, even when you go into those spaces, you are not conscious of your aura, your personality in its subtler levels, and particularly in the lower ranges. And when you are exposed into that space, things creep in, they get a hook into your consciousness and kind of worm their way in gradually. Anything can break in under its cover. Then he says, it is not possible to climb thus from plane to plane. It is impossible. And when the vital is taken by the wrong end, one is in for trouble. It is more obnoxious and dangerous than mere skepticism. These vital beings have utilized this means to get a new point of contact with the physical. Remember 1926. It's happening, and you will recall what we discussed, that a lot of this kind of occultism and mediumism was at the root of the Nazi ideology and the Nazi power structure itself, which then was organized under Hitler's regime to form those groups of 12 people who were meant to become mediums and so on. Happily, Europe is not very sensitive, but if they introduced this in India, the havoc would be great. Then comes this observation. The Hindu is generally so exactly balanced between the physical and the higher planes that at the slightest touch, the veil is rent. Interesting. This was the point which I had referred to by memory. Then Pavitra asks, but the medium do not all have a bad morality? Sri Aurobindo's reply, I am not speaking only from the sexual point of view. Their moral comprehension becomes obliterated and they don't know how to distinguish between good and evil. Then he speaks on about the true nature of occultism and the lower kind and the higher kind and so on. I don't need to go further into this. But this point is important. Their moral comprehension becomes obliterated and they don't know how to distinguish between good and evil. Something of this I had mentioned in the example I had given of certain religious heads who have involved themselves into occult practices in order to gain power, and then they do things which are so blatantly irresponsible and perverse, and when it's pointed out to them, they cannot understand why people get upset about it, because something inside is partly infused with that vital mix. So this is just to complete certain pending elements from last time's discussion, and we can move now to the theme of today with the next question.
Shiva, he's writing, I feel that the forces of division are trying to hold back Indian society by amplifying the caste and linguistic divides in addition to the religious divides. While you have spoken about the Hindu-Muslim divide in the past, the issue of reservations is not touched upon. After 75 years later, there are questions if it is the right way to take it forward, or some reforms or a different solution would be needed.
Yes.
Shall I read?
Go on, please.
The general community, so-called upper caste, feels a sense of victimhood due to the loss of opportunities for their children. Those communities who are getting reservation benefits, OBC and SC, ST, also are entrenching a historic victimhood complex in their mind, similar to the African American communities in the US. Both these mentalities are standing in the way of the unity of the Indian community coming together and reviving Sanatana Dharma. It would be great if you can have a discussion on this.
Yes, it's a very good, important topic, and I'm going to use it as a launch pad for a much broader discussion, of which this issue will be addressed also in part. But just before starting on it, there are two comments in the questions in the chat box which I want to touch upon because they relate to what we just discussed. Nikhil is asking, when Sri Aurobindo says Savitri surged out of her body's wall, is it her psychic being or Jivatman which surged out? Neither. It's actually the subtle body that steps out, and it's a part, it's not even the whole. So even in Ashwapati's yoga, there is a point where first he explores certain things, and then a point beyond which he cannot go further unless he goes into a state of deep trance where the body becomes as if asleep, and he has to go out of the body in order to be able to go into a further exploration of the higher worlds. So at that time it is some part of the subtle body, and subtle body is a general term which can include elements of the inner mind, inner vital, even elements of the inner physical. So what would broadly categorize in the phrase out of body experience, OBE, but within that there are many different kinds of out of body experience, projections, etc. Sri Aurobindo uses a phrase more accurate, which is exteriorization, because out of body experience can be had in two different ways. One can even project a part of the consciousness but without this exteriorization, or project some of the senses directly, or stay in a state of reflection of images, knowledge, or what happens elsewhere, but nothing is ever projected out. Or there is a complete exteriorization where enough consciousness goes out that the body goes into a state of cataleptic trance. Such is the state in which Ashwapati's body goes into when he goes into those higher worlds. And Savitri similarly, I don't recall the exact line you're referring to, but it is a projection of a part of the consciousness, when I think it must be when she is following the god of death and Satyavan. So it's a consciousness stepping out of the physical body. The psychic being is not in that sense separating itself. Second question is from RP, who asks, what about channels like Bashar and Esther? I don't know about Esther, but I had once seen something with Bashar, and I found the content to be, well, interesting and helpful to certain types of questions and people. In terms of what it could offer of a deeper spiritual knowledge, I would say nil. But on a very basic level of psychotherapeutic access, which is a low grade knowledge of things, yes, interesting, useful. But just the fact that anybody accepts to become a link through a physical human being by mediumism automatically puts the source into a grade of the vital worlds. At best something of the mental worlds, but even those types don't like to get into this relationship. They will inspire thoughts, they will inspire ideas. You will say, oh, I had a brilliant idea, it was my creation which I have patented, but it might have come from some higher being in the mental world. But generally when there is a mediumistic connection, it is always a being from the vital world, even if it is from the higher vital. And therefore the knowledge content as well as the experiential content is in the vital range. If it's from the lower vital, then the knowledge is extremely narrow, but it can be extremely manipulative. It will play with your fears, with your desires, with your hopes, with your ambitions, tickle them, and align the answers it gives in a way that you will feel either your ego inflated and you'll say, ah yes, this is exactly what I've always known, and it'll justify, or it will create divisions between you and others by giving you information that divides. It'll say so and so person very close to you is doing black magic on you, and it will break the family, just like that, with the guidance given. So these are extremely dangerous sources. You do not play with them, because even what may appear to be helpful advice may be poisoned. Higher vital may still be somewhat interesting, because it could give you informational novelty, but you will never know to what extent it's true and to what extent it is lying, because these beings inherently are temperamentally used to manipulating and lying. So some of them may be benevolent, but still you never know at what point it swings into a way where they have a high from just building a following, and in order to build a following they will swing the content. It will not be truth content, which will only come from the highest beings who will not compromise the truth. And those types will never allow themselves to be plugged into a human being in this way through a channeling mediumistic relationship. Finally, when you listen, when you tune in, or when you're in the space of that mediumistic experience, or even watching a video of it, you're tuning into the vibration of the being and the entity. In some sense, they also do this for that purpose. They feed on you and your energies. So there are even sometimes benevolent seeming entities, and I say benevolent seeming because you actually don't know what their intention is. They will put up the appearance of benevolence. They will tell you, now you people should pray for the earth, pray for humanity, do such and such a thing, do this ritual, so that it will be good for human evolution, human progress, and to help, let's say, a situation of war somewhere. And so the entire group of followers starts doing all that. And all the goodness and energy of your prayers and good intentions, goodwill, they feed on. They've just created a group of human beings who are providing them a certain grade of nourishing energy on which they will feed. It's not going anywhere to help anybody else. It's just feeding those beings. And in return, they may use that energy to give you back either more specific, useful knowledge, including sometimes financial information, only up to a point. Once they're finished playing with you, they will give you false information and sink you and have a great laugh over it. Or they will give you information which binds you more to their vehicle and access to them. Even sometimes putting subtle suggestions of fear. Watch out, you may have a problem down in this situation or there, and then that happens. So next time you become more careful, and very slowly, you don't realize it, a few months down you become so dependent, you have lost your courage, independence, and you are now bound by the fear. And so there are many such manipulations which are subtle, and you don't realize until it's too late, and when you try to break away, they sense it, and then they play you exactly on the points of your fears. And they know your fears down to your childhood fears, because they can just look at you in the subtle world and just see everything they need to have, just like that. It's one of the easiest things to do. It doesn't require any spiritual development for this. You go in dream state, meet somebody, and you have pretty much the same kind of full access. It's nothing. So, Turban is asking, please talk about vital beings able to possess entire countries like what happened in Germany. How to prevent this? Can outsiders use soul force to prevent wokeism? Maureen also comments that hypnosis can be dangerous. Yes, all of these things, anything involving an occult interaction of any kind, potentially can be dangerous. Hypnosis, depending on who does and for what reason, need not be dangerous if it is a more superficial access and used for some kind of a superficial healing by somebody who has only a limited capacity, okay. But if you go into past life regression or try to enter into states of cataleptic trance to produce phenomena, occult phenomena, under hypnosis, that comes into very dangerous domain. But possession of an entire country can only happen when the country turns in greed, desire towards a certain source, as happened, as I said, during the Second World War in Germany, where the core group which was leading the country was already into mediumistic occult practices, and then they reinforce that. But today, I'm not sure that could happen as easily in a country, but it happens in large collective groups. And this part, I think you're not taking seriously enough. Some of the music that is popularly put out under the various music groups, which are supposed to be extremely popular. First of all, the popularity is often fake. I've mentioned this before, I won't repeat. Just like that, suddenly X becomes top of the charts and everybody now automatically buys the music and listens because, well, it's the popular thing, or you don't have much choice. That's what every music seller is pushing because they say it's top of the charts and you are the sheep who follow blindly. And then what's coming through that music is hypnotic suggestions with the Asuric influence plugged in the words, in the music, in the reverse, the words put in reverse, which go straight into the subconscious as suggestions. And you may not consciously be able to make out what the words are, but it goes as a hypnotic, post-hypnotic suggestion deep inside. I would simply suggest for you to look at actual lyrics of some of these. And when you look at that, and then if you know the background of certain terms and references, it's deeply disturbing. Some of them openly call for destruction of the world or committing suicide. But it's done in words. I'm fed up, give it up, burn it all. And it's as if you are rebellious towards falsehood or people who are being attacked. And so you are rebellious towards them. No, you're being made rebellious towards reality, towards world, towards soul values, and so on. So it's no more a question of a country now. Because of the mass media, these are influences which hit multinationally across countries. And we have to be extremely careful about it. Warn your children if you can. Okay, so we'll continue with the question. The question is very important. Shiva's question about forces of division trying to hold back Indian society by amplifying caste and linguistic divides in addition to the religious divides. So I want to step back from this and look at the whole question from a still larger viewpoint. And that's why I've titled this Regime Change and Colonizing Minds. If you look at the big picture, yes, caste divide, religious divide, these are obvious. But there are other compulsions, and not just limited to India, across many countries, other interest groups, and all of them are using similar methods to divide society and pit them against each other. So Shiva compares this situation with what is happening in the United States between the African American communities and the white communities or Latino communities or whatever community, or even between the women and men, where a division is being promoted. To a degree that sometimes it's so disturbing, everything is reduced to male chauvinism, male patriarchy, and they will use keywords which are deep associations, will say toxic male patriarchy. So you always assume you always relate the word toxic with male or male with toxic, to a point where you cannot even conceive of what is healthy male. If matriarchy can be healthy, cannot patriarchy be healthy if they are both products of nature's evolution? Or is patriarchy always negative and matriarchy only good? Matriarchy cannot be negative, patriarchy cannot be healthy. And if when that is combined, not just with this programming of keywords, with cinema, which shows only dysfunctional families, these are the only images you have. And I've had occasion to see across many spaces in the United States, in certain parts of Europe, and now increasingly within India, children who have grown up with just that content, who unfortunately did not have a healthy example of parents in their own lives. So now this is all they have, and there's nothing to counter. They come away with very deep psychological divisions internally, as well as distortions in personality. when they try to relate to somebody, they slip into all these grooves of programming. And the key words are hypnotic. So the moment this, let's say a girl now who has been programmed in this way, tries to enter into a healthy relationship with a boy, at the back of her mind is all this reactionism against male patriarchy domination. And so either she will try to suppress this person's masculinity and treat anything to do with a masculine symbol as perverse or unhealthy, or she will avoid anybody with a strong character of masculinity, even when healthy, and look for extremely weak and or weakened males. And this kind of relationship is promoted in a lot of the recent woke cinema, so that is normalized. So what are the interests behind? What are the groups which are trying to create such divisions? What are their interests? I want to take a large step back. First of all, you see, in India as well as around the world, there are the religious groups which have an agenda of global domination or colonization. Some of them have been extremely successful going back many centuries. So you have the extremist church conversion ideology. I'm putting it in words very specific. There are churches which are not interested in conversion, which are not extremist and just are happy to do their religion and devotional opening to God or whatever it is. There are such. Very few in number. They don't come up in the media publicity because, well, they are not interested in promoting themselves. But the bulk of what you see as churches, and especially in a place like India, where there is no tradition of church at all, any church that comes is a church which is proselytizing and is interested in conversion and owning minds. It's a colonization of the mind, where earlier colonization was primarily economic and then political. This is a psychological colonization. And it was, I think, in 1988 or 89 when the Pope was invited to India, when the wife of Rajiv Gandhi was being herself hardcore Catholic with very strong ideological leanings to convert India. As a result, the official invitation went from the government of India to invite the Pope. He held this large gathering in a stadium in Delhi, where he announced that the first millennium, it was Europe that was conquered. Europe and Americas were conquered by Christianity. Second millennium, it was Africa that was conquered. And now in the third millennium, he called upon the conquest of Asia and particularly India. Now, what does it mean to speak of conquest by the church? You have to be very careful about what that means, because it's a conquest, literally. What are you conquering? Eventually, implicit is the conquest of the entire space, physically, politically, economically. But that's not the starting point. The starting point is a psychological conquest, a domination and ownership of the mind and beliefs. Because after all, the church is a belief system. Rooted in what? Zero evidence. It's a book which says something, and the book has bad translations going back many centuries, and a story that is made up which can never be verified or validated by any means. So you have basically a piece of fiction of belief system, unverifiable. Why am I highlighting this? Because this is in contrast to the yogic approach. The yogic teaching is built on knowledge that can be verified. So you're given a method here, follow this, it will make sense, and verify if it's true. And not only that, there are many independent verifications, sometimes differences in formulation, but also the entire thing is rationally structured, logically, and you can argue out if there are contradictions logically, which is not the case in the church teaching. There is no logic. It's just a belief of supposed events which took place even physically not true, because they didn't take place in a physical space. Some paradise where nobody knows. But from there suddenly you're thrown onto earth. How? What's the mechanism of transfer? Nothing explained. And the result of all this is a belief only. And so if you follow the belief, and the belief now controls your mind by a combination of guilt and fear. So you are guilty because of a sin done not by you, by somebody else. And in the very act of being born, you now participate in that sin. And you're going to be punished for it. And you have to ask somehow forgiveness or find a means to escape that. Otherwise, you will be punished for eternity. Again, no rationale to it. And on the other side is this fear of the punishment. You will be in eternal hell and the most horrible tortures that can be imagined. But after you have died, you don't have a physical body, so how can you feel pain, or how would the torture happen? Where is this place called hell or heaven? Because it's supposed to be with a body description. And there's even confusion about, is it your physical body which will be resurrected, or are you in some other subtle body? If there is such a thing as a subtle body, then where is your subtle body now? And does it apply to the subtle or the physical? It's a huge mishmash of data, which are internally inherently contradictory. The only way it can survive in your mind is if you blindly believe. So the entire ideology is of blind belief, no reasoning thinking. Now, when such a ideology takes over the mind and conquers it, it must reduce it to a non-thinking belief system. You're allowed to think of everything else but never about this. The nature of reality then is shut from you from a direct exploration. Inevitably, therefore, what you see in Europe is that as Europe turned towards the intellect, and there was the age of enlightenment of the mind taking charge, more and more it rejected the church teachings. Or in certain parts it co-opted elements which it found useful rationally and converted it to something more. And there were many movements such as the Protestants and so on, which attempted to, but still, end of the day, they could not lose the core story and non-verifiability of it. So the part which rejected the church completely and then became extremist in its science, became materialist but now evidence-based but reducing to materialism. So you see this split of reality into a fictional, otherworldly, but then a materialist, reductionist. And again, there's a conflict there. So when an ideology like this takes over a space such as India, where there's already a very rich and sophisticated evidence-based and deep spiritual tradition, it is a huge loss for humanity and for India. The mother makes this observation when she was coming by ship, I think to go to Japan, and on the way in the ship there was this priest who was going to China to civilize the Chinese people, he said. And mother's comment was, here are a people that have already developed their own very advanced, sophisticated concepts of the divine, and what are you going to do trying to teach them and civilize? It's you who needs to learn from them. But this was the case, and a lot of Asia being taken over. That's why Asia is the last bastion which is still resisted. But given the framework we discussed last time, the 100-year war, and what we will look at now in the colonizing minds, given enough time, they can do it. And we'll discuss some of the methods used. In contrast, in Africa, I don't speak of northern part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where the large part of life was largely tribal and of a very instinct-based physical life. The same teaching coming, and I'm not looking at the ideology, it came with certain content of refining of life. To that extent, it might have been called justifiable because it broke away from a low-grade shamanist axis and the idea of a higher one god instead of many little shamanic entities. That might have been an evolutionary help, might be. Again, arguable, but still. So, if the church represents a certain grade of evolution, for somebody who's lower, it could be an aid. Not the best, but still an aid. But for somebody who represents already a more sophisticated, a more refined and advanced psychology and experience of spirituality, it's an enormous loss. And for India particularly, it's a huge loss. Nevertheless, in India, it's not a homogeneous country. There are many elements, pockets, traditions, cultures, including, by the way, In the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, there's one island which is still kept completely isolated, where you have the most ancient and low-grade tribal existence, which have never had contact with what we call modern humanity, and it is kept isolated for various reasons. For this reason, to protect that space and not allow it to be lost for whatever its worth may be for future. But yes, we had many different gradations, including some who were tribal forest dwellers. And you'll see the first entry of the church was towards these. And you could say they could enter because others neglected them, perhaps, but still. Maybe to them it made an aid to shift one level. But after that, overall, at least for India, it's a larger loss. But this is one extremist church conversion ideology, which has a goal of conquering the world with its ideology, with its belief, and with a special focus presently on India and China. The second is an extremist Islamic conversion ideology, which Islam was very successful, beginning in Saudi Arabia, to large parts of Africa, some parts of Europe, until there was a pushback, and the bulk of the Middle East. But entering India, it could only move so far. And even when it ruled as political rulers, it could not complete the conversion as it did in other parts. So if you look at some of the Islamic countries in the Middle East today, they have absolutely nothing left of their past. Even their languages are gone. The same with the church. When you go to South America, the original languages have been washed out. The names of people today are the Christian names. There is nothing of the original names. Even certain knowledge systems were wiped out. And Islam pretty much the same thing. Because Islam also largely continuing from the church draws upon the same problem, with the same irrationality of content, internal contradictions. So for example, maybe I should not go too much into this, but the question can be asked, if you are rewarded in heaven with so many virgins as the story goes, what happens to your wife? She is rewarded with what? The book doesn't say it. Or what happens to those virgins who are now your slaves for life? Is it a hell for them, or is it a heaven? Difficult questions, and they don't fit the test of rationality and logic. So yes, in the progressive parts of Islam, these questions are set aside, a deeper symbolism and meaning is given, and you can move on. But as I'm using this phrase, extremist Islamic conversion ideology, which goes rigidly by certain interpretations or translations of a book, but again with the same original intention of wanting to dominate and take over the whole world. So obviously when this extremist church and extremist Islam ideology collide, they will battle themselves to the death, because all of them offer a paradise if you die fighting for the tradition. So that again is very unhealthy for humanity and prevents forward progress in evolution. Both of these are fully focused on India and large parts of Asia. In contrast, you will find no such ideology for conversion or conquest in the traditions which are native to India. I would largely describe them as dharmic traditions because they use the word dharma. Within the Hindu tradition, the Jain, the Buddhist or Sikh or others, they are quite satisfied to offer a way to a certain experience or realization, whatever may be their goal, and to spread that knowledge to those who want. But there is not the conversion to a belief system where you have to be in a blind belief, because the beliefs are not essentially blind. They are verifiable, they are based on certain evidence, and if you find yourself dissatisfied with it, you are free to move on to another belief that works for you, or improve upon this by evidence and verification that you are then free to practice and teach. And this is the nature of the cluster of various traditions and dharmic traditions in India. And similarly, what you find in China is highly rational in the overall approach. It does not go too much beyond a very heightened rationality to a deeper spirituality. But through Buddhism, some of those insights have also gone and have influenced the deeply rational framework. But nowhere there is this need for conversion or conquest. among these, in contrast to these two Abrahamic traditions. But that's not alone. There is another religious group. I'm using the word religious because of the same correspondence of pattern. Although it's an irreligious group, it's the leftist communist conquest ideology. And there's no extremism. It is only extreme. There is no moderate form of it. Because it has a certain belief system, like the religious ones, which is a belief which is not rooted in any long-term evidence. It is a very convenient belief system, and it goes back to its own preachers, Marx, Lenin, whatever form it may be, according to the nuances. And it starts with certain presumptions which are unquestionable. One of them being the majority always dominates the minority and terrorizes it. Now, if you question, is this true? You find it's not true always. Yes, it can be so, it need not be so. It all depends. And so, taking a very simplistic and superficial understanding, it tries to build an ideology which is very much like the religious belief system, imposes it on you, and builds upon something which requires you to abandon all of the past. So, as an irreligious belief, it's supposed to be rational. It demands that you discard anything else which is not within its domain of rationality. And I say its domain. It can be scientific, but it is not within the domain of leftist ideology. You have to discard it. So the leftist ideology requires you to abandon all of your past, abandon all spirituality, abandon all knowledge, even which can be verified of psychological evidence of certain things and what they call psychic phenomena, etc. And in its design cuts you off from your past and your roots. You are now a rootless thinking being, bound within the framework of this ideology in which the primary key concepts are domination by one group or another. So if you are not dominating, you are dominated. If you are not dominated, then you are dominating. And either way, you have a guilt trip, very similar to the Christian framework. But the guilt trip, now to correct for, you are required to now start doing the opposite. And so, in a very materialist framework, it ends up recreating the same kinds of traumatic beliefs that you find in the other two religious traditions. And even if you provide evidence showing you that these beliefs do not stand the test, it cuts you off or questions you and puts you in a guilt trip. So that's why I put it in a category of a religion, but an irreligious religious ideology. And so India is also under domination of this equally. So there are three groups which are trying to take over the Indian mind, the Indian psyche. There is a fourth, which is not visible in this sense, but which we have spoken about in the beginning of this series of discussion on current affairs, and that's what I will call the Cabal satanic power ideology, which also wants to own the world, rule the world. It's been at it also for many centuries in various means, pockets. But today it's organized and uses the political, economic and media organizations to propagate itself. And it has entered India also and aims particularly at the high level power structures, using the same mechanism with which it has taken over parts of the US or Europe. According to one estimate, and I don't remember now the source of it, they had said that up to 20% of Europe or US already subscribes to something along this kind of the satanic power ideology. In India, I think the numbers may be smaller because the social structure is less organized, much more decentralized with many independent units. But nevertheless, it has come in, and I've spoken before about their public signaling, gestures and symbols. When you see that around, you say, yes, that's coming in. So these four religious groups, I will say, because even this is a satanic religious group, are trying to particularly grip India. The playbook is common among them, and it is the same structure as what we touched upon last time as the 100-Year War. We saw that in the context of China and of the erstwhile USSR, which used similar approaches, but these approaches are the same pretty much everywhere. And if you had to do something to take over a group, a nation, or a people, you would move along pretty much similar lines. So, for example, if you wanted to take over the United States, long term, you want your person to become the president. What are the requirements for president? Okay, you should be born in the US. So, you start by building a group of people who are born in the US, looking ahead 40 years. So when this child born now will be 40, 50 years old, he will be potential presidential candidate. You have to think that far ahead. And then provide the best education for them, build the economic framework, build the publicity image from the beginning. And literally build their image across 30, 40 years timeline. Until at the right time you can nudge them into the power slot, which is by then you've also already built up a community in the power slots which will back your nominee. Now think about this kind of thinking and apply it to India. And it's not new, it's not difficult, it is exactly what the British did when they came into India. So the starting point of British colonization, or for that matter any other colonial power going anywhere else in the world, broadly similar lines. First it began with trade, then it used whatever advantages it had against whatever disadvantages you have. So if your disadvantage was internal division, that was fully used against you. If they had an advantage of some new novelty of technology, that was used, or something which will play on with your greed and desire, that will be used. But bit by bit it would worm its way into a system, build a trust relationship for economic advantage, and at some point it says, well, what's the point of buying from you when I can own you? And the moment it finds a foothold, a weak point, confusion in the lineage of heredity of kings, let's say for example, or in the selection system, it worms its way and pushes forward its nominees for the king. Or as you will see, there are many cinemas made around this theme of a European tutor for the king's son or daughter. And if you can program the mind of the child from the beginning, you will own the child forever and you will own the country, isn't it? Now it may so be sometimes, at least in the cinema it will be shown because it's a cinema from Europe, that what they had were higher values of freedom, of equality, of justice against a lesser, because the story is being narrated from that side. I don't know how much it's true. I don't have enough evidence. But even that being the case, an evolutionary force may use that to lift a people, using the process of colonization even as a means for advancement where so needed. But nevertheless it will be followed with other problems, because with colonization comes also destruction and enslavement of the mind to a point. About this, the mother has a very interesting observation regarding India. She at some point shows extreme disgust for the inertia that she finds in the Indian mind. And I think it's a comment made in the 1960s. And then in a conversation she says, the British overstayed. And it is that which did this inertia. And she said they overstayed by about 20 years. This is a very interesting suggestion, because if you go back to the nature of the events, you may recall this, I've shared many times before, that the mother and Sri Aurobindo were working together for India's freedom on the higher levels, from the occult planes. And what Sri Aurobindo describes later as the overmental consciousness, from there Sri Aurobindo initiates the whole movement. The mother's working there, they're working together. And from the point where the movement takes over and begins to act, and in the overmental consciousness and as a result of its action, in the higher worlds, the change is made. The mother announces India is free. 1920. She says India is free, in a state of deep trance. And Sri Aurobindo asks her, how did it happen? Past tense. Was there much bloodshed? He is trying to avoid that, because that's in the domain of possibilities. See, this is something very difficult for us to understand, because it's a state of consciousness in which you're simultaneously aware of a whole realm of impulses, forces, pulling, pushing, and within that all possible potential outcomes are seen, felt, known in the identity of consciousness. And you identify with a certain thing and push, shape, and compel events to move in a certain way. When you have a mix of, let's say, 100 different possibilities and forces, you cannot do a rational decision. This happens in a state of consciousness of a very high grade, in which, and this is only possible in that truth sight, you see the optimum means and you push towards that from that higher consciousness. So what I'm describing is something like an approximation of that experience. And you push, and there's a resistance. And eventually a breakthrough is made, and now it's done. And from the point where it's done there, the rest is a working out through the grades of consciousness, using circumstances on each plane and all the forces until eventually it's compelled here. So that's the kind of initiated action there, but it's done. There's nothing you can oppose, you can only delay. So what Sri Aurobindo's question, was there much bloodshed, because he is trying to avoid that? Mother's response, no. They went as they came, all in the past tense. The world situation had changed and they went as they came, and that's it. And you see this. You also see the bloodshed, not as much as might have been otherwise in the partition of India, where many million lives were lost by this religious bigotry of butchering. Trains coming from Pakistan, as they were leaving from Pakistan, people who did not want to leave, it was their homeland and it was still in their areas majority Hindu, but by a line drawn by the British and the Nehruvian acceptance and Gandhian acceptance of it, these were forced to migrate and artificially create a majority Muslim state in Pakistan by this forced migration. As the trains would leave and these people had just been abandoned everything, their homes, ancestral homes, everything, just the clothes they are wearing, at best a little pouch of whatever they thought most precious. As the trains were leaving, there would be these hordes, pure religious hate ideology, butchering every single person, man, woman, child, and allowing the train to cross over into India with the dead bodies, again and again, for days and weeks and months. This is separate from the people butchered on the spot. So when finally Pakistan became Pakistan, it was 20% Hindu population. Within 2 decades, it was less than 2%. To this day, you have stories of a Hindu girl who is abducted by somebody, forced to marry, converted, or sold off in slavery. It's happening as a daily routine. Under the Sharia law, it is acceptable, and so it continues to happen. Now, this, I'm showing you the ideology and what it does and the suffering it caused in the split of the country. And you have to understand how hard Sri Aurobindo and the mother worked to prevent a worse outcome. And even this could have been avoided if Sri Aurobindo's suggestion for the Cripps mission being accepted had been taken. But why am I describing all this? Because this gives you a sense of how the British had already worked to conquer a people. And the conquest of the people led bit by bit through this same process of the 100-year war to enter, take over kingdoms, take over kings, until at some point through a long process of this takeover, the entirety of India now comes under British rule. And from that point on, it is open exploitation. But still, that's not enough, because there were repeated attempts at rebellion. So it had to move into colonizing the mind of the people. It was not just enough to control the power centers. So began an entire process of replacing the educational system of India. And the entire structure of education in India was destroyed. A new programming was put in place. Vernaculars were suppressed. Sanskrit as a language was removed, and English brought in, and the English teaching. With it came a new history that is written, which basically said you had no meaningful past. All that is of value is brought to you from Europe. Look to Europe, and that's your future. Now, this colonization of the mind, remember, is the only way that you can own a people long enough, because when the people choose to be slaves through a colonized mind, that's the only way you can retain them. Otherwise, inevitably they'll be pushed back, and you can't hold too long. But a people who has been reduced to slavery have also lost their soul, because what they're living is an artificial imposed belief system, not aligned to their soul values, which is the direction in which the overall evolution of their civilization had been going to. So it creates this internal conflict. On a deep level, one could say all these people are damaged because of this conflict. Nevertheless, from an evolutionary perspective, such a situation can be used to accelerate certain kinds of development. But I come back to the point why I got into this whole discussion. The mother said the British overstayed. And as a result, the inertia in the mind. 1920 this was done, and by 1922 the British were on the negotiating table, and Gandhi was one of those who said, no, we don't want the freedom now, and the postponement of 20 years took place. Had that not happened then, perhaps this inertia of the mind would not have been. This is the implication of mother's comment. So I'm showing you here what happens when there is this imposition of an external ideology. Even if used for an evolutionary purpose momentarily, if it overstays, it can damage. And then there is a long period of undoing the damage, etc. So I've spoken of these, let's say, 4 religious domination tendencies currently focused on India. Into that we will add 3 more ideologies, which are state level ideologies which wanted global empires. There is the former USSR, which at that time needed to become a worldwide empire, let's say, which was paralleled at that point by the emergence of China as an equivalent, but it was nothing at that point compared to USSR. And the other side was the United States, which had its own ambitions now to become a global empire. Between the two, the United States, from an evolutionary point of view, had a greater potential because it at least represented superficial level of freedom. The cabal entities controlling were still underlying, let's say. There was sufficient freedom on the surface. So between the two, it would have been better for India to align with the USA rather than USSR. Nehru chose the latter, which again can be used for growth. So mother made this observation regarding this in these terms. She said it would have been more useful for India to have gone through a brief, I don't know the word she uses, but I'll use the word colonization, by the United States than by USSR. Why? Because she said the only thing the Russians can teach India is the truth of community, which India has already learnt. But there's something else that the United States can teach, and it had to do with what she described as India's loss of the respect for matter and the group discipline. These are 2 things, she said, which were lacking: collective discipline and the respect for matter, both of which had been lost through various things, including particularly the ascetic and otherworldly ideology, world renouncing, which said that the world is an illusion, and so on. The result was matter being illusory. It doesn't matter, nothing matters. So your temple, which is your most sacred, is also your most dirty, isn't it? So there were attempts to correct for this, Sikhism being one of them, and you will see to this day a Sikh temple is one of the cleanest spaces. Why? Because there has been an attempt to reconnect the spiritual with the material, and particularly with the aspect of the use of power and force. And so it was the first attempt at reform within Hinduism, which again separated into separate religion later on, etc. But this is just to point out to you the nuances of these alignments of interests. So Nehru chose USSR. With it came a very strong communist influx into India. And that is one of the big banes of India today, because that entered into the ideology entered into the educational system and in the media. Nehru put the entire media center under the hands of USSR, and the educational framework also influenced by socialist advisors and so on. The result was this. What it does, and this is the skill of the leftist method of conquest, it looks for every line of division. in society, and there are many. Okay, there are many subgroups, and amplifies and divides further the gaps, the differences. Now, it's not new. The British used the same thing. It was a policy called divide and rule. It was a stated policy of the British Empire. But this was turned into a social engineering exercise by the leftist mentality, followed by the similar manipulation used by the church. And so, one of the things they created under British rule was this whole thing about castes. Now, the word caste itself has no correspondence in India, in Indian tradition. And yet, every time you're told Hindu, caste problem. The word caste itself comes from a Portuguese word. In India, there were two terms. There was the Varna, which were only 4, and they were psychological types, which could be extended into hereditary, or there were Jati. Jati is lineage, hereditary lineage, and communities. So, there would be a potter community, there is a woodworking community, there's a knowledge community, there's a warrior community, and each has its own distinctive characteristics. Broadly, 4 psychological types was the Varna. So, untouchability itself is a very specific distortion of a particular material circumstance. So, those, for example, who were traditionally priests in the temple, they had to bathe 3 times a day. They had to be extremely careful. After bathing, they were not allowed to touch anything to maintain a certain physical purity for being before the idol during that. Once they finish their prayers, they don't need to do that. So, there were situations where, while they were coming from the river bath, if they did something, they stepped on something which was not clean, or did something which was contrary, they had to go back, take a bath and come again. So, there were situations where somebody who's working in a space which is not so comfortable or clean would be said, okay, stay away from me, don't touch me. This can get institutionalized, and where you have human egos, it can get organized even with some separation of superiority, which you see even in the Europe as the class superiority. But inherently, the Brahmin, who is supposed to be the dominant caste or Varna, inherently was poor and could not hold wealth in their very definition. And if you look at British records, they say how the so-called poorest, the Shudras community, are the ones who wear gold jewellery. Brahmins don't. Why? Because that was the nature of the lifestyle values of each community, had its own responsibilities and its restraints. It could not do certain things. Brahmins could not eat meat, for example, but the Kshatriyas could eat meat because they had to go for war, they needed the strength. Brahmins, being optimized for knowledge, could not eat anything which made the mind more coarse or heavy. So, there were certain do's and don'ts which had a rationale for it, which made for distinct communities. Within the communities, then specializations, sub-communities. But what happened was, under British rule and before that also under Mughal rule, because the Brahmins held the knowledge, they were very interested in owning these, because with them came the knowledge to govern as well as the knowledge for specific technologies. And so, with that came a reward. So, under Mughal rule, for example, if you had served the king, you would get a reward of land. So, certain Brahmins got land as a reward and became then landowners. And then, as happened in Europe, equally the landowners and then the landless, and there's a relationship of domination or dependence, which could easily become exploitation if you are not a good person. So, similar patterns. But it was nothing inherent to the Hindu tradition. But the British made it such by declaring that, and they made a census which they called a caste census. They found more than 2000 different castes. Every community and every family name was called a caste. And now Hinduism was built of caste system. So the result in practice was, this being instituted was pushed down to a degree where the society itself was divided along lines of communities and names, jobs, etc. And as if to amplify this, they would hold matches, sometimes between religions, sometimes between communities. So you would have a cricket match between Jains and Hindus. So obviously each side would root for their community, and as a result you build a certain antagonism between the communities. If one loses, then it is upset with the other community. And all such methods used to push the division to the maximum. So what I'm saying is it's not something new. It was done under British rule, and it was a mechanism for colonizing the minds, but also for ruling people in the long term. And where somebody did not align with your ideology or your objectives, you replace them simply. Now this process is extended by the communist ideology. China followed subsequently after the USSR breakup. China took over the place of USSR with the same communist ideology. Russia today does not have the same goals of world domination. It has no such interest. So yes, of course, influence is always a question. When you have economic influences, economic interests, you always want to influence everybody for your benefit, and that every country does. A bigger country has a bigger influence. Similarly, in the United States, at least as it was before the Second World War, there was no such concept of needing to rule the world. But particularly after the Second World War, and I've explained this in one of the early discussions of this topic, the Nazi ideology was transplanted into the United States and became the core of the military-industrial complex, which then continued the Nazi ideological objectives, which was owning the world, bringing it under its domination. And then the US became an agency for this. The problem was not everyone in the US was part of this. So you had a front which was a very nice, helpful and even open front, but a core behind which would use the front to hide behind and manipulate it to gain its outcomes. So certain wars were started, and the American people were fooled into aligning one side or other through the use of media and so on. So you have to understand the US government has two sides, the public side, which has a very benevolent side even, and then the cabal side, which has its own manipulative objectives. China is not so simple, because the Chinese Communist Party is, as if, at least in its position with the world, a monolith. The people of China don't have much say. It's the Communist Party which decides. And when you have been ruled long enough, down 2 or 3 generations, you don't even stop to question. You just accept that you'll be looked after, they will do what is right, and that's it. So there is a domination of the Chinese people, but that same model is attempted to be expanded to the rest of the world. So these are the two state ideologies today, which have a global empire of domination mentality. And so India is also playground for them, for their control systems and so on. As part of this comes then the interest for regime change. First you work to own the minds of the people, which the British successfully did. When they left, what remained was still ideologically aligned to those goals and was easy to manipulate. But gradually, the innate spirit begins to push forward, there are changes taking place, and with it come these other interests which want to control. First the USSR, United States, and the now Chinese, which work more subtly. And one of the things they all need to be able to do any kind of control of mind or change of regime to align to their interest groups, they need to have people in the country who are theirs, owned by them totally. And so that's where the 100-year war mentality comes. Start by building from childhood. What's the easiest thing you do? And you'll find this in the church strategy. Get children who have no parents. So the first thing they do is open an orphanage. Now actually you don't always get enough orphans because there are not so many. If you look at India, for example, today you will have hundreds of orphanages. In a single city you will have several dozen orphanages. But do you have so many orphans? Look at the statistics, the numbers don't fit. Let me take an example closer home. In Oroville there's an orphanage run by good people. It has some 20-30 children. As it turns out, many of them have parents. But because the orphanage is providing free lodging and free food, the parents are happy to leave their children there and come once in a while and look after them. and meet them. But the orphanage is raising money saying, look, we're looking after 20, 30 children who are orphans. Some are genuinely orphans, and those cases are amplified, and you assume everyone else is like that. So for them, it becomes a vehicle for raising money. I'll give another example. This is a religious group somewhere in India, no need to name. The first thing they did was, they had a land. The first thing they did was they opened an orphanage. So now all the orphan children were raised with their ideology, and the head of the religious group was made their effectively spiritual father or preceptor. So suddenly you had a core group of people who are deeply rooted to your ideology and look upon you as their benefactor, the one who gave you life. And that's your core team for managing the entire ashram community. Free service, free workers, but totally ideologically aligned. They'll never leave because from childhood they've been formed in that way. And it works. So they had these people dressed in fancy clothes, etc., and doing their thing. So visiting that place, it was obvious that it was built like that. Church does the same. It starts with the orphans and then builds from there a core base of workers, free workers. And in the ideology, similarly, they have this thing that you give your life in service to God, and then you'll be rewarded in heaven. Obviously, not in this life, but in heaven after. So you have these nuns who dedicate their lives, and they become the free workers. The problem, of course, in more recent times, nobody wants to be a nun because you can see the life is much more comfortable outside, and somehow this doesn't align anymore with the mood of with the time spirit. So they don't get enough nuns in Europe. What do? They come to India or other countries in Asia, where you can still get people who are poor enough that they will give their children to become nuns in your so-called orphanage, who become now for you the free workers for the future, and these nuns are then imported into Europe because they don't have enough people committing to that kind of free work there. So there's a mentality, you have to understand how the thinking works, and it's a long-term mentality. Now, if you do this and get a few people committed, next thing now you do is insert them after having built up your base of workers, you insert them into power structures. So you will find the church has a special machinery to train people, especially for placement in the Indian administrative services, Indian police services, or in certain multinational businesses, etc. They groom them, they train them, they help them pass exams, and then they have their key people who help them in the placements. So they create a placement agency in which only their people are given placements, and they target specific companies. So everybody who's put there in placement comes from their ideological background, and eventually they take over the company itself, because now the key workers there are yours, and through them you can influence company strategy and policy. Now this has been going on in India going back at least 50 years, and 50 years is a long time to build effectively 3 generations. And so certain companies, certain political institutions, certain political parties, and for the rest, the easiest way is you pay money. And so this is of course the mechanism used by all the intelligence agencies, or combining with honey trapping, where you trap the person in a compromising situation, film it, and then use blackmail to control them. With that, now you have an entry into the entire state machinery, power structure, media structure, military structure. And to the extent you are able to get into these, and in the bureaucracy, and then in the educational system, to the extent you are able to get into these, you can control an entire country's destiny. The problem is it's not just one group. It's, well, I said 4 ideologies, of which 3 have had a very long run. They've already got in, and between them there's a tension also. Of these, 2 are particularly powerful in India. Currently it is the church, which is financially better organized and intellectually better organized, and the Communist Party, which has had the greatest head start in the educational field and so influencing young people. Islamist ideology is still rooted in certain forms, which is they are powerful in many parts, but don't have yet the same grip as the other 2 have in the larger ownership. But that's not enough. Remember, all of them need to own fully. So one of the methods used for owning is divide society along as many fault lines as possible. And one of the key parts of that strategy is to break the underlying Hindu value system, let's say, use that word, which has been holding India as one. Sanatan Dharma is the term that Shiva has used in his question, one overall spiritual umbrella with a similar outlook towards an evolutionary turn. But what you have to do next to be able to control is divide along every such fault line of identity. The British did it, so there was already a precedent. You just had to continue to build it. And this term Dalit, for example, is an invention of at a later stage, and today particularly used by the church to promote a certain ideology, and it's one of those trigger words. If you go in Europe and they will say, the Dalits in India, so if I ask them, what do you mean? What is wrong with the Dalits in India? Oh, they are the people who have to carry the night soil and the human waste of the upper castes. Is that true? Is that true? That's the story projected. And along with that, constant story of victimizations and attacks against Dalits. So let's say that there's a theft that takes place. Somebody went into someone's house and stole. And the reason was purely a theft, greed, economic. Now they'll say, Dalit attacked by, find out the other, and it works. You find the same pattern in the United States. If the person being attacked is black, then the news item will say black attacked by white. But if it's black attacking black, then they will not mention it is black. If it's white attacking white, they will not mention it is white. But they mention the race only when it is white attacking black. And so it builds an image, it builds an impression when you have this repeated messaging that takes place, until it seems as if a group is victimized by another group, to a point where the entire group, even if you have never been attacked, believes itself a victim. And this has been built in the USA as a critical race theory, where an entire race is now declared as oppressed. Even if you are not, and even if in the facts of data the race is quite wealthy and powerful, as is the case in India with the so-called backward classes or scheduled tribes. Some of them are more wealthy than the Brahmins. They have far greater power structures, organizations, political influence, economic influence, but they are still oppressed, because that's now the belief system of the left plugged in. And for the church it's very convenient, because now these are the people, you are oppressed, we will liberate you, convert to our religion. That becomes the messaging. When this is then combined with political power, and there was a point where it actually happened under what is currently in the opposition rule under the Congress party, certain states, people were selected for their religion to become chief ministers, police chiefs, and the bureaucratic chiefs, election commissioner, all selected on the basis of religion. And you have to ask yourself why. And it's extremely dangerous, because then that process was completed with an attempt to do a religious census in the Indian Army, in the armed forces, where they wanted to bring out statistics of the religious background and the caste basis for the armed forces. Had this process been completed, that would have been used in a statistics to break up the army and break morale. That's when the then army chief resisted, blocked it, saying, we are all, we work together for the nation, and we don't look at ourselves as on the basis of caste or community and so on. But that pushback took place, which put a limit to the damage which was attempted. But you have to see this as part of a strategy which is played in the media deliberately. And at election time, all these stories suddenly surge up. So I'm going to complete this. I've gone in some detail with this, because if you don't understand how this happens, you will not understand why the news is what it is. And I'm linking this with regime change, because that's the way by which you trigger the overthrow of a power structure. We have reached our time limit already, so I will not go into the power structure overthrow. Maybe that will be for next time, but I'll just complete with a couple of examples recently. When you remember 2014, when Modi was about to come to power. It had not happened. Nobody expected him to get such overwhelming majority. But across the country, the mood against corruption was so strong. The Congress party knew it would lose because the data was already there among the media studies as well as through the internet, the monitoring that takes place. It was obvious. They knew they would lose, but who would come into power? So they propped up a certain groups. Among them, there was one group which was propped up, which it's not clear who was backing it, but there's a group which is US based, which was primarily funding NGOs run by the person who became the head of Aam Aadmi Party, AAP, Kejriwal. And when he was being propped by the media, there was a period of about 3 months, I remember, from November through to January, from 2013 to 2014, the media was pushing this, and it was combined with the demonstrations which had been done where Kejriwal, part of a larger group that people trusted, I forget the name of the person doing the demonstration, against corruption, and he seized that, broke away from that group and became a political party overnight, and the push of the media to support him. What was interesting was he came to power on the promise that he would eradicate corruption, and aimed particularly at the then Delhi chief minister, whom he declared had corrupt, made a lot of money during the Commonwealth Games and so on. He said on being elected he would arrest, etc. When he did get elected on the plank of anti-corruption, what was interesting was he did nothing of the sort. And when in the public he was asked, what about this chief minister that you said you will arrest? He said, bring me the evidence, I will surely arrest, but you bring me the evidence. The whole story flipped overnight. But at that point, what was interesting, just before the election, there were a series of cases where a church was vandalized, a mosque was attacked, and a third church, there was a fire which took place where the central idol was burnt. And they all said miscreants of Hindutva ideology. Now, Hindutva ideology is one of the phrases used by the mainstream media to criticize anything which is associated with Indian culture or traditions. So, it's a catch-all word. So, the result was a polarization along religious lines, which is what got him to power. Once in power, he spent, in the first year, some 100 crores for advertising budget. The advertising budget was bigger than all other. Why? Because that money which you're paying to newspapers and TV channels ensures that they only give a positive report about you. Otherwise the money stops. So this is a normal communist takeover ideology, that they pump money into the media to own and control the media. And then they ensure their own people go up the chain and so on. Now I'm taking this very specific name because the data I'm tracing in the way he flipped in the presentation and in the ideological positions is very much obvious. It was visible to a lot of people. And then later now you can see the level of corruption which is within their party. But this is to show that there's a very well thought out long-term strategy where people are built up and prepared. And I'm going to take one more recent example, which is the recent smoke bomb attack in the Indian Parliament. I'm putting it in the same category, and it's all in preparation to the mood of the people and the management of media with political intentions. So watch what happens. There's a group of 6 people, one is the master and 5 across states. They've been in touch going back at least 2 years. They met 1.5 years ago in Bangalore for specific reasons. They go back to their homes, continue to do their activism controlled by this one man, and they don't meet physically. They're in touch on the internet. They give themselves a title which is deceptive, and through the internet they're communicating. The group never goes beyond 5. I'm pointing to this because it's that same structure I mentioned earlier in the Antifa. It's a cell, 5 people, 1 controller. These 5 people are now suddenly activated. They come from 5 different states to Delhi. They buy the smoke bombs, put it in their shoes. 2 of them manage to get passes to go inside Parliament. 2 others are outside. And according to what they said, the 2 people outside had planned a self-immolation, that they would burn themselves. But He says, we could not get the gel which would protect our skin from being burnt. So we didn't do the self-immolation. Meaning the self-immolation itself is a drama produced for influencing media and shocking the nation, but they ensure that they are not severely damaged. Now, why would you agree to go through that danger, even with gel? There's always a risk. Why would you agree to go through that danger unless there's a strong ideology and strong benefit, financial benefit? And remember, you've never met the other person other than once, 1.5 years ago. You're in touch only online. Why do you commit yourself to this group and follow the orders of one man unless there's a lot of money coming in from that side and that's how you're living a very comfortable, cushy life? And the messaging they were saying, we are jobless and therefore we're going to do this. The other two who got into parliament, they're in the visitors gallery. One of them jumps from the gallery, jumps across the desks, throws this smoke bomb which releases yellow smoke. Immediately there's chaos. All this is on record, video, photography, etc. What is fascinating is, while there is chaos, the opposition party leader is standing up and staring at the gallery while the smoke is spreading from the bomb. And this is again on photograph. Then the opposition is now pushing this, saying, see how courageous he is. While all the others were running away, he stood with great courage facing the gallery from where this person had jumped. Now, if you stop with the surface, you would say, that's what it looks like. Now go deeper. If suddenly someone releases yellow smoke in a high security zone, let's say you're in an airport, and there's a big bang, explosion, and yellow smoke starts, your first thought would be, this is poisonous, and you'd run away, which is what most people did. Leader of opposition is not afraid. He's staring at the gallery from where this fellow has jumped. He's not looking at the fellow who's jumping and exploding the bomb. He's looking at the gallery. Why? Because there was a second person there who did not jump, which is immediate suggestion that this person knew that there was going to be such an attack. He was waiting for the second person to jump and was wondering why he has not jumped. Why would you stare at the place from which someone has jumped rather than watch what he's doing? Unless you knew there was something else happening there or was supposed to happen and it didn't happen. And he knew it was a smoke bomb, there was no danger, so no panic. And you see what happens, the same person now comes out and repeats the cause of this is they were jobless. The same thing which these people say to the police later. The story messaging is exactly the same, but he knows in advance what is the story to be repeated. And so you have to understand, a lot of events like this in the public space which are meant to shock you are managed and intended and used for swinging public opinion or changing the mood of a nation. And this is, remember, just before elections. We are due for elections in 3 or 4 months. This is setting the mood for the elections, and it does not matter what happened in the last 4 years. The crisis is created now in a series. This is only one. There will be many more which will come. In a series will create in you an image of chaos, confusion, and insufficiency of whichever government they are against. And this is organized by the parties as well as the controllers behind of the parties. And there will be many such. If you're conscious of this, you will watch and you will be careful not to be swayed by these images or the stories which are promoted. The next thing, which was part of the original strategy, they insisted on the Prime Minister and Home Minister standing up and making a statement, which they did not do. When they did not do, then they had to go ahead with the plan as they had it. They all trooped into the well, the opposition parties trooped into the well of the House and blocked all further discussion and passing of bills. Going against the rule book of the House, they got dismissed, they got thrown out, and suddenly in the history of India, you have never had so many opposition leaders thrown out in one go. But it was intentionally done. Those who had not trooped in the next day and the third day, they kept doing that, and then they said, we are just supporting our brothers who have been thrown out. No, that was the game they were going to do. With the Prime Minister or Home Minister present making a statement, they would have raised a ruckus, blocked further proceedings, and then blamed them. And this is all the visuals and public imaging. to create an image that these two are responsible for some failure in India. And it was targeted. The same thing you see with the recent story from the United States of India attempting the murder of a US terrorist called Panun, Khalistani terrorist, who's openly asking for killing of people in India, who's openly threatened Indian flights leaving the US for India, saying he might bomb them on specific dates. And the US government is saying, we found evidence that someone in India was about to kill him, and it's coming from the Indian government. What's the evidence? Look at the data. Very interesting. Somebody who's an Indian citizen in the US, I'm not sure if it's US citizen or Indian, he's in Czechoslovakia, currently in jail, is a known arms dealer and a known trafficker of drugs, under watch of US FBI. Gets a phone call from someone in India saying, please kill so and so, and we are planning to kill 3 or 4 other people, including some Canadian person, and you do this for us and we will pay you so much money. Just think about it. If someone in India, in the intelligence agencies, had decided to, let's say, kill this terrorist in the US, they would have sent an unknown person, not someone who is in the midst of an arms investigation. You send an unknown person with a clean record, do something clean and go away. That's how it would happen. You don't call up somebody else and say, you do this, and you don't reveal your own plans for killing other people. It's the most ridiculous thing on a phone call, knowing all international phone calls are monitored. It's the most ridiculous thing. But this is what you would do if you wanted to set up India to blame somebody else. It's called a false flag attack. So you would have your own agent somewhere sitting in India who would make the phone calls, you would record it, and then blame someone else under whose orders supposedly the phone calls will be made. So when you look at these kinds of allegations being made against the Indian government, against India, or to divide Indian society along caste and community lines, or to shift the discussion for elections from the achievements of the present government to the insufficiencies, not enough jobs or whatever it is they want to create. Observe the way the media is playing you and know that all these events are manipulated by certain groups. What's actually happening behind the scenes is intended, planned, and with the control of the media, you create a mood and swing for regime change. Create an impression, get people restless and upset, and then prop up a leader who leads them off track to a specific outcome. So this is broadly the picture as an introduction on this whole approach to colonizing minds to be able to own and then leading to regime change using crises and killings. We'll look at a few more examples next time of specific regime change and also link it to the war in Ukraine as we will go to that. I think this is a big enough picture for understanding. And the reason why I said this coming year is so important, because there's so much at stake. And the same you will see in the United States, the divisions between races and different subgroups will be suddenly accelerated with crimes supposedly committed by one group against another, and it will be amplified in the media. And all of that will be used to blame, in this case, Trump. If you go back about 4 years ago, there was a film actor called Jussie Smollett. He was a black American actor, not so well known, but he comes suddenly with a noose around his neck, bleach on his face, and said, I was attacked by 2 whites who said, this is MAGA country, you have no right here. And they attacked him, terrorized him, tried to hang him, put bleach on him. And he stands before this video camera to ensure it's all recorded and goes to the police station and files a complaint. Immediately in the US Congress, his controllers push forward an anti-lynching act and slam it through while the mood of the country is against this lynching which was supposedly attempted against him. As it turns out, the police did its due investigation. They found out he had paid $3,500 to 2 people from an African country. They were both not even black Americans, I think they were visitors. And they had bought the noose, they had bought the bleach, they had put it on him. He had put up a fake show and made a fake accusation against whites and against Make America Great Again, which was Trump's motto. Finally, he got jailed. But before that, they exposed him with photographs showing he was very close to some of the Congress people, etc., who had pushed through the Anti-Lynching Act. But it was all set to create a mood against the so-called whites who had a superiority against the blacks and create racial divisions and stain the whole theme of Make America Great Again. That was just a small example, a small sample of how this is played. Expect much more in the next 1 year. Be careful, don't get carried away. Look at what's behind, apply your common sense, and where possible, speak up. In your own little circle, tell people, don't get carried away. There's a lot at stake in these elections. Don't trust, do your homework. Look rather at the achievements and what people represent, not the image created by the media. Look at their actual actions and make choices based on that. So, and then of course, yes, V-Truth points out they're still again bringing out the coronavirus scare and so on. We don't know, it's going to be complicated, but be vigilant. That's all I will say. I think that's all we have time for today. We'll have to continue this in the further discussion next time. I think, any comments, Narad, Alina? Okay, fine then. Let's take a moment to stand back from this whole thing. The forces of darkness rely upon chaos, confusion and division. Forces of light build on unity. And this is the message that the mother gave to Indira Gandhi, who became Prime Minister of India. She says, let India work for the future and set the example. Thus she will recover her true place in the world. Since long, it was the habit to govern through division and opposition. The time has come to govern through union, mutual understanding, and collaboration. To choose a collaborator, the value of the man is more important than the party to which he belongs. The greatness of a country does not depend on the victory of a party, but on the union of all the parties. This is 6th of October 1969. Very interesting. So it gives you a sense of the huge difference in approach. And wherever you find this movement of unification of a people to serve the country, for the greatness of all, that's the way forward. Wherever you find divisions, appeasements based on one group against another, quotas for one against another, divisions and benefits for one against another, you can be sure this is going to be harmful. So the other message which she gave to the President of India, Shri Giri, 1969, she said, let us all work for the greatness of India. Why? Because for the spiritual message and example that India has to place and spread into the world. And so we can take that as our theme for concentration. And as we work for the greatness of India, let the people in the United States work for the greatness of the United States, people in Russia work for the greatness of Russia, and every country work for the greatness of their national genius. The value of a civilization is in terms of its highest achievements. Last time we spoke about Israel, the last 2 times also. What does it offer for the world to grow and to benefit? Judge it by this. And for every country now to be able to concentrate on what it has to give for its own people and for the world, for the human progress, for human evolution, that's the worth, that's what you work for. And so each one of us, wherever we are in the world, in whichever country, whichever nationality, whichever community we live for, let's work to bring the best forward for the larger evolution of humanity.